Shabbat Shalom. So before I begin, I just want to say that last month when our rabbinic intern, Shira Kraus, was here, some of you may have been here on the Shabbat that she visited with us, and I told her before she came, I want you to start working on your Drash about a month before, because I really want to work on it and workshop it with you. And so we kept going back and forth, and she'd send me something, and I would send her back all these comments, and then she'd rewrite it, and I'd send her back all these comments. And finally, she called me, and she was so frustrated. And she said, you know, I feel like I can never make you happy. I keep sending you something, and you just keep sending back these comments, and I keep rewriting it, and we've been going on and on for a month. And I said, Shira, what a great privilege to spend a month really chewing on what you want to say and thinking about your work. And it comes to this place where when you stand up here, you feel like you're saying what you want to say. I said, one day, not so long from now, you're going to be a real live rabbi. And then you're going to have about 45 minutes to write your drash. And you're going to wish you had a month to say really what you want to say. And she said, oh, I didn't understand that. Okay. Well, I was thinking about her this morning when I threw away my drash for tonight, and I decided to start all over again. And so I come to you with some thoughts that have not had a month to prepare, though I could imagine these ending up in a Yom Kippur sermon that does take a month to prepare. But tonight I want to share some thoughts that have been in my head. They're not perfectly organized, but I think worth us talking about, as Michael so beautifully introduced, that the idea here is to really contemplate and listen to ideas from all over the place, ideologically, and to chew on them, to debate them, to discuss them, to talk about them in the car and talk about them here in the foyer, and think about what resonates and what really doesn't. And that's where we're at as a community that's very confused. So we find ourselves in this place in these few weeks between Purim and Pesach, between the story that is about the attempted annihilation of the Jews, and by the way, these really two women who are heroines and upstanders in the Purim story, and the story of Pesach, which is about coming from a very narrow place and going out, about believing that we're headed somewhere, which links us to this week's Torah portion where we're told to keep a fire burning. It's not the Torah portion that talks about the Ner Tamid, but rather a fire on the altar where sacrifices would come. So the idea is that we're going to keep on keeping on. We're just going to keep on trying. And sometimes that feels easier than others. I noticed this year when I read Megillat Esther, when I read from the book of Esther, a phrase about Yad Chazakah, a strong arm with which we are protected. And that phrase appears in the Haggadah as well, when we read the story of God taking us with a strong arm and with a strong hand and an outstretched arm out of the land of Egypt. So the rabbis were always very clever, linking these, one foreshadowing the next holiday and linking them all together. So we find ourselves in that spot now between Purim and Pesach. And it so happens that I read this article in The Atlantic. Have you read this article yet in The Atlantic? Nobody? One. Okay, 2, 3, good. 4. Okay, we had a few readers of this, so that means everybody else should just find an hour this weekend, find it online or find it in print, and read this article. I dare say, and the 4 of you who've read it can definitely contradict me. I know no one hesitates to do that. I love that. I think it is perhaps one of the most important articles that we could read at this moment. No, Leslie says no. Okay. Afterwards, you tell me why not. But for right now, I'm going to talk about this article. I think it is an incredibly important article. Leslie will tell you at the Oneg why it isn't. But it's called The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending. And it's an article written by Franklin Foer, who I happened to go to Columbia with, and who we knew was a genius way back when he was 17 years old. He's proven himself repeatedly since then to, in fact, be a genius, which I think his language in this article is quite eloquent and quite beautiful. I also listened to the interview of him last week, thanks actually to Lisa Erdberg, who doesn't even know this, on the Harvard Hillel series of interviews that you introduced me to, connected me to. And he talked a lot about this and answered a number of interesting questions. So the idea, he was Frankie at the time, he's Franklin now. So Franklin Foer's article happened to be published in this time between Purim and Pesach. It was written surely before the death of Joe Lieberman, though he comments on Joe Lieberman in this article. And I just want to read you a couple of sentences that he says about this. He says, over the course of the 20th century, Jews invested their faith in a distinct strain of liberalism that combined robust civil liberties, the protection of minority rights, and an ethos of cultural, oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong. I was like, why does that not make sense? That's not the quote I wanted to read to you. The quote I wanted to read to you was, Jews accounted for roughly 2% of the nation's population at the time that I was in college, but I'd estimate that my undergraduate class at Columbia University was 1/3 Jewish. Soon, 1/3 of the justices on the Supreme Court would be Jewish as well. In 2000, Joe Lieberman, a Shabbat-observant Jew with a wife named Hadassah, fell 537 votes short of becoming vice president. None of these occurrences sparked a backlash worthy of note. He comments on exactly my time overlapping with him in the early 90s on Columbia's campus, but I think it was true in most campuses in America. There was really a feeling of strength, of excitement about being Jewish. And this quote, I think this part of his article shines a light on the Jewish population in the United States at that time. It was a time of joy, of strength, of excitement. The article lays out something which I think would be helpful for all of us as we try to navigate and understand what's going on in the world and what's coming at us. It struck me as I was reading this article that there are really 3 separate issues that have become so intertwined that we almost can't imagine them separately. Anti-Semitism, Anti-Zionism, and Anti-Bibi-ism. Bibi as in Netanyahu. Anti-Semitism, Anti-Zionism, and Anti-Bibi-ism. So let's talk about anti-Semitism first. As Franklin Foer said in the Harvard interview, anti-Semitism is an accusation that Jews have too much power. So throughout history, I think recent history, certainly in these years, we've been known to be powerful and yet using our power to support other people in the community. And this was the quote that I was starting to read incorrectly. Over the course of the 20th century, Jews invested their faith in a distinct strain of liberalism that combined robust civil liberties, the protection of minority rights, and an ethos of cultural pluralism. They embraced this brand of liberalism because it was good for America and good for the Jews. It was their fervent hope that liberalism would inoculate America against the world's oldest hatred. We tried very hard to live our social values and believed that it was good not only for America, but for the Jews. An interesting combination that has proven maybe or maybe not to be true. Several months ago, I gave a drash that got people actually shouting from the Kahal. And I just want to remind us of Rabbi Danny Weiner's beautiful article that has continued to live large in my mind, that was the beginning of that drash. He talked about a sense of feeling more a part of the world and of the values, the liberal values that we espouse in Reform Judaism, than of specifically being Jewish, identifying as a Jew. Franklin Foer writes in this article, the intersectional left self-consciously rebelled against the liberalism that had animated so much of institutional Judaism, which fought to install civil liberties and civil rights enforced by a disinterested state that would protect every minority equally. It was the work that we did. We went out to support all people equally. And yet, it may or may not have served us well, as we imagined that we were not only upholding the values of America, but upholding the values of Judaism. Issue number 2 is anti-Zionism. Anti-Semitism certainly lives out there in many of its forms. Anti-Zionism is the belief that Israel has no right to exist. And what we found is that people who feel that Israel has no right to exist based on their understanding of history or their political views, this hatred seems to bleed over into a hatred of Jews in general and anti-Semitism in general. It turns into anti-Semitism out there. I'll tell you a story about my next-door neighbor, 2 anecdotes from recently. My next-door neighbor came running outside. We were doing some work on the basement and had to get a permit from the city to do this work on the basement. And part of the requirement of the permit was to put in a new tree on the sidewalk. Well, I like trees as much as the next guy, so I was happy to do that. The city inspector came out to tell us where the tree could go based on the water pipes and the electrical cables under the ground, the head of urban forestry, and she drew around the part of the sidewalk where the tree had to go. I called a guy who had a big jackhammer to come and break up the concrete and to put the tree there. And on the day that I met the guy with the jackhammer to install the tree, my next door neighbor came running outside, waving her phone around. Her husband was on speaker on her phone. "What are you doing?" she screamed as I stood there next to the director of urban forestry. "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, we're doing this remodeling and we're required to put in a tree, so the inspector here just drew where we should put the tree, and we're just going to put the tree here, and then don't worry, you don't have to pay for the tree, we're paying for the tree, and the city will take care of the tree. It's not a problem." And she turned to me and she screamed from her driveway, "You've taken enough of my land." The director of urban forestry turned to me and said, "Do you have any idea what she's talking about?" And I said, "I do, actually." I said, "I was born in 1974 in San Francisco, California, and I haven't stolen anything from this lady. But unfortunately, she has attributed the pain of her own experience and her own people to me. And that anti-Zionist thought has resulted in her anger with me trying to put a tree on a street, on a sidewalk that we share." Last week, I went to a doctor's appointment and got in a conversation about anti-Semitism in San Francisco nowadays, and she told me that a young woman had come in for a medical procedure and at local hospital here, and 3 nurses walked in to take care of her with pro-Palestinian paraphernalia on. And somehow, I'm not sure how, because the woman was in no condition to get into a political conversation, but somehow in this space, they discovered that she was Jewish and refused to take care of her. So after sitting for an hour and a half, urgently needing a medical procedure, she ended up being transferred to a different part of the hospital and received this procedure. But this is the interaction, these kind of small yet enormous interactions that we have where politics bleed over into interpersonal, where anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism. Number 3, anti-Bibi-ism. Bibi as in Bibi Netanyahu. So a lot of American Jews, I would say almost all liberal American Jews, feel very uncomfortable with most of his policies. And certainly on October 6th, when Shimrit Braun Kamin was here speaking on behalf of Unacceptable, she was talking about the movement for democracy in Israel and the need to change the policies of the government. On her drive home that night to the East Bay, she turned on the radio and heard what had happened in Israel. But even before that, for the many months before that, when there was marching in the streets, our community and most American Jewish communities were very much in favor of a different kind of government. Franklin Foer wrote in this article, part of the reason I failed to appreciate the extent of the anti-Semitism on the left is that I assumed its criticisms of the Israeli government were, at bottom, a harsher version of my own. I opposed the proliferation of settlements in the West Bank, the callousness that military occupation required, and the religious zealotry that had begun to infuse the country's right wing, including its current ruling coalition. What a powerful sentence that is, a harsher version of my own. And one more quote I want to share from this article. Liberal Jews once celebrated Israel as the lone democracy in a distinctly undemocratic region. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition of theocrats and messianists seems bent on shredding the basis for that claim. But many governments in the world share these undesirable traits. Still, no one calls for the eradication of Hungary or El Salvador or India. No one defaces Chinese restaurants in San Francisco because Beijing imprisons Uyghurs in concentration camps and occupies Tibet. All of this political pushback has resulted so damagingly in anti-Semitism, has rolled right back and become anti-Semitism, though it might have started as something else. As Foer said, Zionist can start to sound like a synonym for Jew, and I think that it has. We discovered this when we listened to the congressional hearings with the 3 university presidents who famously talked about the context in which anti-Semitism on campus might be experienced. The context, as I said then, and I believe now, has to do with Israel. I don't think that a context of pure hatred against Jews just because they're Jewish would be tolerated. But it's all become intermingled, commingled. And confusing these things leads to condemnation of Jews in general. It's misguided hatred of our people and of our traditions because it's intertwined. Those of you who were here just last Friday night saw a protest outside, or maybe saw a protest outside. It was covered in the J this week. The protest was against Miss Israel, who was holding a dinner next door in Newman Hall, a rental of our property, but we knew that there might be some response to it in San Francisco. The J explains that the protest that came here, and some of you may have seen it, it was actually started up at the park and had a very kind of bloody message, if you read the article in the J. It was organized by a group called Queers Undermining Israeli Terrorism. Okay. And the article explained that it is the mission of this group, quote, to build support in the Bay Area queer communities for Palestinian liberation. The leader uses the slogan on their website, quote, from the rainbow to the sea. Unfortunately, this kind of protest, unfortunately, this kind of intersectionality and lack of understanding of what's happening in the world leads right back to anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, the people who believe in the work of Queers Undermining Israeli Terrorism, the group that was outside last Friday night, seem unaware of the fact that almost exactly 1 year prior to the attack on Israel, on October 7th of 2023, on October 5th of 2022, a 25-year-old Palestinian man was decapitated, seeking asylum in Israel because he's gay. He left his home in Hebron and came to Israel to be saved from what he feared would be a violent retaliation. So the lack of understanding of the actual values of the democracy of Israel, the lack of understanding of the separation between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Bibi-ism, result in a backlash against the American Jewish community that becomes very hard to separate out or respond to because it's so intermingled and it's so uninformed. The inability to separate these things haunts us now. We stand at a very important moment in history, I think, and also on the Jewish calendar between Purim and Pesach as we look back to the near annihilation of the Jewish people in the Purim story. We were saved, but just by a margin. How we come out of this narrow place in history is yet to be determined. But as we head into the Passover season with a mandate to ask these kinds of questions about freedom, about what needs to happen for us to go forward, about the places where we are not free, about the narrowness in which we live, we must remember, and we tell the story each year as if we personally were in the land of Egypt, as if we personally were freed from the slavery and the narrowness. We must remember that we've been in Mitzrayim, in the narrow place, in Egypt, many times before, and God took us out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. We live now at this time in these moments between the precariousness of Purim and Pesach, ready to engage in the dialogue and the questioning that our Seders require of us as we discover and uncover and debate what freedom might actually look like for us and for everyone. And trying to separate out what has become this overlapping intersectionality that makes no sense and that puts us in danger. We pray as we go into this season of freedom, this season of struggle, that our struggle will actually result in an ongoing quest to keep the fire burning on the altar, like it says in Parshat Tzav, even when we don't know what lies ahead. We know that our relationship to the world, to history, we've been in this precarious place before. And as we come from Purim into Pesach, this reminder that it is the vigilance of communication, of debate, and of dialogue that is held up by our Seder. It is what the Seder is about. Gives us strength to continue to discuss all of this and to try and bring truth to a world that seems bathed in untruth at this moment. Shabbat Shalom.